I'm wearing leggings today, so to avoid wearing one of those packs was very helpful. So yeah, come on up if you're here for this talk. It's good to see you all. If you were here for the last presentation, then you've already been through this, but I would like to know for myself, for those who are new as well, just to get a sense of who you are in the room, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I'm in this room. So if you are a classroom teacher, raise your hand. Okay. Some other kind of staff at school, for example, social worker, counselor, SEL, culture, climate. Okay, great. You're an outside program that works with schools. Raise your hand if you do mindfulness or SEL with schools. Okay. Anybody in higher ed? Yay, okay. Okay, did I leave anybody out? Research, well, that kind of higher ed, research, whatever, yeah. Yeah, whatever. So I feel like everyone needs to say a little bit about how Tracy found them. So why am I here? I'm Amanda Moreno. I'm here from Erikson Institute, which is a graduate school in child development in the city of Chicago. And we have been doing for the past 4 years a fairly large randomized controlled trial comparing a mindfulness-based approach to SEL to a more standard approach to SEL. So in other words, our control group wasn't doing nothing, right? Our control group was doing SEL, just not a mindfulness-based approach to it. We're working on the analyses of that right now, but at one point it was written up in the Atlantic, which I think is how Tracy found us. But the point is that I might sort of come to this mindfulness world in a slightly different way than many of you have. Like our speaker this morning, he said, he had his own mindfulness practice for many years and then sort of realized how helpful it would be for kids. It was sort of the other way around for me. So I come to the world of education as a researcher, as a professor, and what I profess is child development. So I am about child development first, before mindfulness, both chronologically and also philosophically. Although I'm a believer in mindfulness, so I became a believer throughout this process. And the way I view it is that it's an extraordinarily handy tool that can be used in support of whole child development and whole child nurturance. And so I'm glad you're here, Heather, because this kind of tag teams pretty well from what Heather just spoke about the integration of SEL and mindfulness. And so I feel like I'm maybe taking it even a little bit of a step back from that to look at whole child nurturance. And as part of it, you can see from my title, it's a little bit of a Debbie Downer type of title, right? Because I know another topic that's of concern to many of us, and that's happening at this conference and elsewhere, are the topics of toxic stress and trauma, and how does that intersect with mindfulness? And so part of what is my job today is to tell a little bit of bad news before we get to how to deal with the bad news. Because I think it's important to do that so that we reduce the distance between us and them. So we talk about trauma, we talk about ACEs, and in some places it's becoming common to say something like, we all have trauma, right? I don't know, we could probably have a whole debate about that. But my point is that it doesn't really matter if it meets the official definition of trauma or not. Children have heavy loads to carry. And so we have to get a little bit heavy today to think about that before we can go on to thinking about mindfulness and how that can be a part of the mix of supporting whole child development. And this is a mindfulness in education conference, which means we're focused on the context of school. We had a person at Heather's talk say, what about at home? And that was an interesting question for me to hear, because I usually think of it the other way around, that normally we think of mindfulness as something it's just that we're teaching it in school. But the reason we're teaching it in school is because we want kids to be able to be mindful anywhere, right? And I want that too. But I'm talking today about why mindfulness is necessary in school itself. Because school itself is hard and is a heavy load on kids. And what can we do to lighten that load? That's what today is about. So, a wise woman once said, and first I'll tell you who the wise woman is. If you know anything about Erikson Institute in Chicago, you would probably know that one of the founders is Barbara Bowman, who just became, I think I'm saying this right, a nonagenarian. So she just celebrated her 90th birthday, and she was one of the founders of Erikson Institute. So this quote came from just a conversation between she and I. And she said, "The greatest mental health challenge a child can have is school failure." And I thought that was a really interesting thing for her to say, because I think we usually approach it the other way around. We think, what is wrong with kids that makes them fail in school, right? What problems are they bringing to the school doorstep that make it more difficult for them to function in school? And that's not to say that that doesn't happen as well. It's out of concern for kids. All of us are concerned for kids, right? But kind of turning that on its head a little bit to think about the fact that, some kids are more cut out for school than others, right? And so they might fail in whatever definition you would use for that, and that creates a mental health problem for them, right? Because we don't do what we can, and when I say we, I mean the whole system, right? To help them meet those challenges in the best possible way. And so we end up creating mental health problems for kids by the way they may be treated in school. Why is school stressful? I get this question a lot, like, come on, how hard is it, right? Especially in the early childhood range, which is where I focus my research. There's lots of fun stuff in school, so why should we think about school as being stressful? Well, normatively, what I mean is this is just kind of happens to all kids. Development is hard. Growing up is hard. We don't think about that a lot, just because everybody does it, right? But change is hard. So when you think about like a mother who's breastfeeding and thinking about going through that period of weaning the child off, right? Not every baby, but in some babies, they sort of act like, you're killing them, right, to do that. It's a hard thing to do, and it's hard for, the parent to deal with that, and it seems like you're doing something awful to the child. But really, they're just growing up, and it's hard. And that's definitely true at the age where they start school, too. This, what they call the 5 to 7 year shift in developmental psychology, is another seismic developmental shift. It's when children start to become more adult-like in their thinking. But they're just starting, right? So it's a seismic shift, it's a hard thing to have happen, and it's where school plays out. When you're in school, you're almost never in a state of mastery, right? So kids are always hearing that message. The minute you get that skill, you're going on to the next one, right? You don't get that, and you could say the same is maybe true for adults because we're always learning on our jobs, but right? We have a little bit more autonomy to kind of stay in our comfort zones. Kids don't have that, right? So they're never in that state where they can just be showing what they're great at. They always have to move on to the next thing. Non-normatively, meaning this doesn't happen and doesn't have to happen, doesn't happen to all kids, We have, of course, the testing and the punitive accountability culture, which I've already seen referenced several times this morning. In a way, SEL is a sort of a counterbalance to that, right? So we all experience that in different ways. And school personnel are not supported in self-care, right? We've all talked about that as well. The importance of adult SEL, the fact that adults' needs are not addressed, right? And yet we're asking the adults to address the kids' needs. So how do we do that? And unnatural pacing and transitions, right? So school is really not designed to go with human beings, circadian rhythms, right? You might have heard the research about how, teenagers aren't morning people, right? But we don't shift the day, because of football practice or something. I don't really know why. But, and for young kids too, right? Sitting in seats for long periods of time, and then maybe, again, that minute you get absorbed, it's like, oh, clean up to the next thing, right? So it's not quite a natural situation, school. So it's stressful. This is a little bit of the bad news about school. Okay. Anybody familiar with this? The 5-to-1 ratio. What is this? Anybody know? Yes?
5 positive statements about your abilities versus 1 that would be critical.
Correct. So it's 5 positive statements to 1 negative statement. And this is required for what? Does anyone know where this came from? What field? All right, Adina's cheating, but go ahead.
It's Gottman's research on marital relations.
So John Gottman is the foremost marital researcher in our country. And he came up with this ratio to say that he can predict divorce with 94% accuracy with this ratio. So what he does is he invites couples into his lab and he says, talk about something challenging. Now you might think, well, they're in the lab, they're not really going to show their real stuff. And that's true to some extent, but it's enough. It becomes real enough. And you can be any sort of style of couple. You can be a more like pacifying couple. You can be a more volatile couple. You can be the more sort of in the middle, like we're good at conflict resolution. You can be anywhere on that spectrum. But if you meet this ratio, you have a much higher chance of not getting divorced. So that's where this ratio comes in. And I've been thinking about it, and a few other scholars have as well, in terms of how this could apply to the school setting, right? You can already think about that. And you know that this ratio is true. There's not evenness between positiveness and negativeness, right? So just think about a day when you've had a compliment. Maybe your day started out with a compliment from your boss, right? You're like, cool, this is good. You're floating on air a little bit. And then after that, you get a criticism, maybe from somebody else. Does it feel like you're kind of at a wash? It's okay because I had that compliment, right? No, you obsess about the negative part, okay? So you need so much more positivity to just get to neutral. And why is this? This is because of something that human beings have, which is called the negativity bias. And we have the negativity bias because of our evolutionary history. So we think about the saber-toothed tiger, and that's sort of the stereotype. But even if you think about it about less dramatic things, like the stones you have to walk through to get to a particular source of berries, right? It's not as bad as a saber-toothed tiger. But yet, if something happened when you took that path where you fell down, right, you're going to want to learn that pretty quickly so that you don't fall down the next time, right? So it's evolutionarily adaptive for us to be highly attuned to the negative. It helps us learn very quickly, and it helps us survive. So it's a survival instinct. This ratio is really all about a survival instinct. But the problem is that in the modern world, many of these challenges have already been solved for us. We have modern conveniences where your literal survival is not at risk so much. But nevertheless, it's part of our DNA to still have that focus. And that's why we need things like mindfulness, right? We're trying to sort of fight that battle, right? Be able to focus our energies where we choose to focus them, right? As opposed to being hijacked. So that's what the 5-to-1 ratio is about. And like I said, sorry that's really small, but if you're interested in the research, I can provide you that reference. This is just one of 2 studies that I'm aware of where they did this in the classroom, where they worked on literally just the SEL intervention, if you will, was just a positive to negative training. And they even had little like watches, little wristbands that kind of gave teachers reminders with a little bit of sensory feedback to use some positive commentary. And this is something that we're interested in our group to pursue on a broader scale. So we've talked a little bit about sort of how the bad news applies on a broader scale. And now I'm just going to take a quick break and make sure that we understand what happens at the extremes. So this is kind of a model of what happens with toxic stress and how it kind of starts to manifest in the body. And basically, the sort of the third square over, the under or overreactive stress system, is where I want to focus your attention for a minute. And so this is, again, related to kind of this negativity bias that we've been talking about. What happens is that over time, you adapt to bad things. Right? One way of adapting to them is to kind of ignore them, right? So that would be underreactive. And another way would be to overreact, right? To be always ready, right? So you know about fight or flight. This is basically what that is. So if you have repeated exposure to situations where you need to bring forth your fight or flight response, this trains your physiology and it trains your brain, and it gets embedded. And when we have to start engaging our thinking brain, which is when we get to school, right, this can cause problems. So your thinking brain becomes disengaged, you're really focused more on your emotional brain, your amygdala, and these pathways become etched. And it becomes very difficult to overcome that, right? So you might be trying strategies in classrooms that kind of work on a more global scale, but it doesn't work for the kids who have more extreme things going on in their backgrounds. Okay. Raise your hand if you know about ACEs. Okay, so you've all heard about ACEs, or most of you have. I'm not going to go over this too much. But basically, we know that if you're exposed to 6 adverse child experiences, which is what ACEs stands for, this can shorten your lifespan up to 20 years. Now, this was retrospective research, the original ACEs research. It asked people to remember what events happened to them. But since then, there's been a lot more research that has given more concurrent support to this. Because there's actually been some research to show that the memories are not necessarily that accurate. But again, they don't have to be because it's having the impact anyway. And so, I'm going to tell you about 2 examples of this. So this slide is really bad news. You're going to hate it. I'm just letting you know that. Okay, and I call it not so terribly toxic because what I'm about to talk about would not constitute ACEs. Okay, so the stress exposure that I'm going to talk about in these two studies would not have met the level of what we would call an adverse child experience. But nevertheless, the biological impact occurred. Okay, so in the first example, so you might know of, I'm going to talk about a friend, like not if it happened to you, but if it happened to a friend, because you see yourself every day in the mirror, right? But maybe you have a friend who you don't see that often, but you know that they have been through a stressful experience, say a divorce, say they have taken care of an ill parent or something like that, right? And you see them maybe 6 months later, a year later, and they look different. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, wow, stress really ages you, right? And that's true. So there's actually a physical underpinning for this. And it has to do with our chromosomes and the little tips of our chromosomes, which are called telomeres. And basically, as you age, your telomeres get shorter. It's kind of like aging a tree with the rings. Our telomeres do that for human beings, right? So you can look, well, you probably can't, I can't either, but a geneticist could look at somebody's telomeres and kind of be able to age them, right? And so this research looked at the telomeres of 9-year-old boys. And the boys kind of were split into two different groups, less disadvantaged and more disadvantaged. And the way they defined disadvantaged was a few different things, such as parental education, but I'm focusing on this issue of what they called harsh parenting. Okay? And this is self-report. So the parents are reporting on their own harsh parenting. Okay? So you might say, well, they probably underreported it, right? And that's probably true. But what's important here is that the two group comparison, right? And so what I really want to point out is that in the two different groups, the harsh parenting group had on average 7 incidences of like yelling or threats in the last year. The less disadvantaged group had 3 such instances over a year. So again, maybe they're all underreporting, but the fact is there's only a difference of 4 events on average between the higher and lower risk group. You see what I'm saying? So when you hear 7 instances of yelling or threats, that doesn't sound so terrible, right? It falls way short of what we would call chronic abuse, certainly, right? And so what they found was that indeed, that stress, even that level of stress, which is bad, but not awful, right, had in fact shortened the telomeres of the 9-year-old boys so that they looked older. Their bodies were older because of the stress that they had experienced. Does this make sense? Okay. Okay, well, if you think you hated that one, you're going to hate the next one even more. Okay, so this is research by a woman by the name of Graham. She does research on, she looks more at brain, so she doesn't look at chromosomes and DNA like the previous one did. And she asked parents to report on their own level of interparental conflict. So again, it's self-report. Parents are reporting how often they have arguments, okay? Not physical violence, just how often they argue. And it's not asking about how often you argue in front of your child. Okay, I want to make that clear. So we don't know that. It's just how often in general do you argue? That's the question, all right? And then what they did was they hooked the babies, 6 to 12 months old, up to a brain scan, and found that for those babies who had been exposed to a higher level of interparental conflict, maybe in front of them, maybe not, we don't know, they had a more vigilant brain response to a negative sounding voice. So what they did was they had a male person. You might say that's a little bit sexist, but that's what they did. They had a male voice sounding angry. But the voice was not speaking real words. He was speaking like gibberish that sounded like English. They have fancy ways of doing these things. And so it was an angry sounding male voice. But the scary part about it is that in order to get brain scans on babies, you have to do it while they're sleeping. So, while the babies were sleeping, and you're playing this angry male voice in the background, right? The babies who had been exposed to a higher level of interparental conflict had this sort of vigilance response. So remember we talked about fight or flight? I'm ready to go. That's what the babies were experiencing. It's in a group of brain structures known as the default mode network. And they're supposed to be sort of at a level, kind of, in a level area. But they were hyper responsive. The babies who had been exposed to less interparental conflict by their own parents' response did not have such a hypervigilant response. Yikes. And Graham went on to do further research to show that those responses that happened just in the lab, with the brain scans, did go on to have more, I don't want to say permanent, but more long-term, shall we say, effects. So the babies who had that hypervigilant response in the lab, whose parents had the higher levels of conflict, went on to have more fussy and difficult temperaments. Okay, so there's debate about temperament. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Here's a pretty good sign that there's a lot of nurture in temperament too, that fussiness may be due to things that they're experiencing, right? Whew. So all of us have perhaps stressful things in our households from time to time. And it's important we know that it's getting into the ether somehow. Another way that I like to think about this and look at this is you can either call it brain bandwidth or you can call it cognitive load, whichever term you prefer. But when I was talking at the beginning about how children really do carry a heavy load when they come to school, not just those who have been traumatized, right, in the official sense. This can manifest in terms of cognitive load. And so this is research. I can't pronounce the first guy's name. The second guy, his name is Eldar Shafir, and I've seen him speak, and I really like their work, and I speak about it whenever I get the chance. Because they do a lot to debunk this idea, again, about some of the toxic stress that's all too common in our society, such as poverty, right? Just not having enough resources to get by. There's this kind of myth of the individual, the individual achiever, right? If you have enough grit and enough gumption, you can overcome anything, right? Which sounds nice, but the opposite side of that is kind of blaming the victim, right? It's your fault if you're in this situation. It's your fault if you can't cope. And so this research does such a great job of debunking that. And so I highly recommend the book if you jive with this kind of stuff. But I'll just give you a couple of examples. They went to the mall, and they just got study participants at the mall. And they had like a little computer station with some cognitive tests there. And so the people at the mall were, they were from a variety of socioeconomic statuses, right? Some people were there just to window shop. Some people there were there to buy a lot of stuff. So it was a diverse group in terms of the money they actually had. And then what they did was they told them that here's a pretend scenario. So they know it's pretend, and they tell people, pretend your car broke down. And to one group of people, they gave them $250 to fix their car in this pretend scenario. And to the other group, they gave them $3,000. I don't remember the exact numbers. But that's what it was. So it was just a pretend scenario. Everybody knew it was pretend. Think about that. And now take a cognitive test that had nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with cars and insurance and money. It was just a cognitive test. Well, what do you think happened? Exactly. So whether, and that was true whether you had money or not in real life, right? So it wasn't even like the people who had more money could be like, psh, I know this isn't real, right? They were thinking about it. And so that cognitive load took some of their ability to function away. I always say, you know, something like, oh, I don't have enough IQ points right now to think about that, right? We all know that sort of sensation, right? That your like literal smarts have gone out the window because you've got that cognitive load and that stress. So you can induce this effect experimentally, and they also show it in the real world with sugarcane farmers, who basically, by the nature of the business, are rich half of the year and poor the other half of the year. Literally, that's how it goes. And again, the usual line from society is, why don't you save the money from the part of the year that you're rich? That's all you have to do. Save the money from the part of the year that you're rich, and then you'll be fine in the part of the year that you're poor. What's wrong with you that you don't do that, right? And so doing this research with sugarcane farmers showed the same thing. They literally had high IQ during the time that they had money, and lower during the time that they didn't. And so the other way to think about this, though, is that it's not that poverty makes you dumb. It's actually, it makes you brilliant, but about the wrong things, right? So think about it. Think about times when you have been low-resourced. And they also show this through, if you have more money, it's still happening in more well-off families as far as time poverty, right? So we've all talked about the time poverty issue. We talked about time scarcity this morning, so it can go either way. But when you have this poverty, this cognitive load where all of your energy is being taken up, doing the things that you have to do just to get through the day, right? So you're actually brilliant at that. You become brilliant at that. So people who don't have a lot of money become really, really skilled at being able to move stuff around, move their schedules around, move different things around so that they can actually get through the day. But it's not what's valued in society, and it's not what allows them to thrive in the long term, right? So there's this issue of cognitive load. And again, kids at school have that cognitive load. Think about all the things that we're asking them to do, even if they don't bring a ton of stress to the school doorstep. So I say just picture the difference. Again, I'm using an example that's not abuse and neglect, because I want you to know that it doesn't have to rise to that level to have that impact. So think about a child who, like in the top picture, one of the kids, they know exactly who's going to pick them up and when from school. And they know the physical space that they're going to be in. They know that they're going to get a snack. They know where and when they're going to be doing their homework. That's taken care of. So think about the level of engagement they have in the last half hour of the day, right? Versus the child on the bottom, who, again, there's no abuse, there's no neglect, and basic needs are even met. It's just that the schedule kind of changes. He doesn't necessarily know who's picking him up, can't visually project himself into the future, into which space he'll be in while he's doing his homework, right? So it's not a tragedy. It's just that he's thinking about it. He's wondering about it. And so his IQ points are taken up with it. So he's not engaged in what's going on. You see what I'm saying? It's not a trauma. It's not an ACE. But it's enough of a cognitive load to cause that distraction. So that's part of what is our job to handle as people who want to nurture whole child development. We want to think about children's cognitive load and be able to help lighten it a little bit. So I'm going to sum up this little part of it, and then we'll go on to a little bit more about mindfulness. So toxic stress becomes biologically embedded, as you know, but it doesn't have to be all that toxic to become embedded, and that's really the point that I wanted to make. Adaptation saves one's life, but it comes at an enormous cost. And for kids, it comes at an enormous developmental cost. For example, distraction. They can't really engage in the last half of the day because they're thinking about what might happen after. Events that fall far short of abuse and neglect can produce some of these same effects, which we've seen in those two research studies, sobering research studies that I showed you. The trip from reduced bandwidth to toxic stress is far shorter than once thought. So we know, so this is why I use that word resilience in quotes. I don't like the word resilience, and I'll tell you what I use instead of it. But kids don't just get over it, right? And even if we're not talking about children in poverty or children exposed to dramatic levels of toxic stress, this is relevant for all children at least some of the time. And the way we do school in this country makes it worse. That's the other point that I want to make, right? So we don't help kids with their cognitive load. We make it worse, right? So what can we do about that? Child and family systems, like school, therefore need to buffer. And that's my word. I like the word buffer, buffering rather than resilience. And I'll tell you more about that on the next slide. But we need to buffer these experiences, including the normative ones, right? It's more of an old-fashioned thing to be like, well, that happened to me when I was a kid, right? Just buck up and deal with it. But it turns out that normal development is stressful. Okay, and we've been hearing about this more and more these days with teens who are in relatively privileged circumstances experiencing stress, anxiety, depression, suicidality. This is where this starts. Okay, so why do I like buffering rather than resilience? I think resilience implies more of an outcome or a trait, and I think buffering implies more of a process. Right? A process that needs to be supported and assisted. I think resilience implies that the child is responsible, whereas buffering implies it's an action that we do. Now, I want you to take care of yourself too in order to be able to do that. So just keep that in mind. I'm not asking you to do the heavy lift all alone either. That's not good. Resilience is kind of after the fact, right? It happens, now you're going to bounce back. Whereas buffering can happen at all points on the process, right? There's things that we can do at all points on the stressful process to support kids. Resilience implies child will be fine. Buffering implies child needs my protection. Resilience implies bouncing back. Well, why should they go all the way over to the bad place and then have to bounce all the way back, right? Let's make it a shorter distance. Let's buffer it and soften that landing. And then, as implied with the outcome, resilience is a result from lots of buffering, right? If kids experience lots of buffering from adults, they're going to end up being resilient. So how does one act as a buffer if you're a teacher or any other professional who works with kids? Does it mean you have to be every child's therapist if you're not a therapist? These are questions you've heard, right? These are concerns you might have, or you might have heard other people raise these concerns. Does it mean you have to be a touchy-feely person, showering kids with sweetness and affection nonstop? Does it mean you have to do the job of raising the children, since the parents don't or don't do it right? Again, it may be a concern you have, or it may be a concern you've heard other people raise. Maybe these are a little bit old-fashioned. Maybe you're like, I'm more progressive than that. We're past that point. But what about this one? Does it mean that we should prevent kids from taking risks, failing, or working very hard? Is that what I mean? Look at my face. You know that's not what I mean. But nevertheless, right, we have voices inside that might bring these concerns up for us sometime. How do I make the landing so very soft for them, but at the same time support them in being brave, right? And the way we do this is with love. But again, I'm pointing out, love is not just about being soft. Love is also about being brave. So the big thing that Mary Ainsworth discovered that was different from what Freud said was that you get independence through dependence. The reason you feel brave and courageous is because you can depend on someone, because you've had that history of being able to depend. So before Mary Ainsworth, we used to think that picking kids up when they cry would reinforce crying. She found out that the opposite was true. Again, we're modern, we're progressive, it doesn't sound so revolutionary, but it was at the time. But there's still that old-fashioned tendency in some of us, right? Comes out sometimes. So the point is that with attachment, with love, your roots give you wings, right? That's exactly what attachment is for, right? So we talked about the negativity bias. Well, in evolutionary terms, the reason why attachment exists is to make you be brave enough to go out into the world and explore it and learn and do things. Okay? So love is not about constantly showering kids with sweetness and affection, unless that's your style. But that's not a lot of people's style, right? So no, you don't have to worry about that. Any kind of personality can work. You don't have to be Susie Sticky Sweet to be a great teacher or to be a buffer. You don't have to be. I've seen, video examples of classrooms where, the day starts with like a big, bold affirmation, right? It's powerful. It's not sticky sweet, it's not timid. But it's establishing that sense of belonging, okay? Okay. We're running out of time here, but see if I can get through this. Speaking of buffering, rather than contributing to forming scars, I now want to tell you a story in 15 tweets. So this has to do with, so I've just gotten through telling you why I think you need to be really careful with kids' hearts, right? But you may know, as mindfulness people, that there is some concern out there that mindfulness might not be being so careful with kids' hearts. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you heard these? So here I'm talking about headlines such as this. Mindfulness, meditation, and trauma. Proceed with caution. Why mindfulness and trauma-informed teaching don't always go together. Have you seen this? Right? And so the concern is that mindfulness might bring up stuff that teachers are not prepared to handle if we're doing mindfulness in classrooms. I share this concern, by the way, but this is the background, so I'm just going to read you my little tweet storm about this. A lot of talk lately about the intersection between mindfulness and trauma-informed. There are many misconceptions. First, mindfulness is not a trauma trigger. Being treated poorly is. Being around adults with little understanding of toxic stress and trauma is. Not experiencing a sense of belonging is. Being in overcrowded and under-resourced classrooms is. What do people mean that mindfulness can trigger trauma? I think it's that kids cry or get angry or have breakdowns in self-regulation. These reactions have been part of classrooms forever and can happen in response to any stimulus that opens up the heart. I have seen this happen in response to traditional SEL, as much or more than mindfulness. I saw a boy break down during an SEL lesson on bullying, but it turned out that he was sad because his grandfather died the night before. He hadn't cried earlier in the day, and what I mean by that is the SEL lesson started, and then, right? So it was permission. He picked up on the signal from the SEL lesson that now is an okay time to feel things. Is the key takeaway from this that we should avoid SEL lessons because they trigger upsets? Of course not. So why is mindfulness such a target for this caution? I understand that people are concerned about whether teachers are adequately trained and have adequate support to be able to appropriately handle children's trauma reactions. I share this concern. Everyone in this space does. But trauma is present in the classroom right now. So what I mean by this is we hear this a lot too. Well, teachers have to be right with themselves before they can be right with kids. Well, sure, but in the meantime, they're teaching right now. So what do we do about that, right? Are standard classroom practices less triggering than mindfulness? Does adding mindfulness make trauma worse? This is backwards thinking. Yes, teachers need to be trained. Yes, they need to be careful. But why do we so easily forget that teachers are professionals who learn new programs and curricula all the time? Why the hand-wringing over mindfulness instead of over creating a more humane educational system? I never suggest that mindfulness is a silver bullet or a cure-all. It is one tool in the toolbox that teachers can use that even when done by a non-expert, and we could have a whole day-long conference about that little phrase, can be helpful in making overwhelming feelings slightly less overwhelming. Some have found that when mindfulness practices include long periods of internally focused silence, this can produce trauma reactions in kids that are extreme and should only be handled by mental health experts. True enough, but developmentally appropriate mindfulness curricula for children, especially the younger ones, do not employ long periods of silence. And there's plenty of good program options out there. So what do? They emphasize practices that are embodied, involving movement, grounding exercises, such as self-hugs, and outwardly focused, right? So you might look out the window or listen to the room for sound and silence rather than just right here, right? Ideally, your SEL program should also include plenty of self-compassion and self-care practices for teachers to help them manage the increasing demands and intensity they face every day. Thus, the concern about mindfulness may actually be somewhat less, meaning less than standard SEL, precisely because it is a more embodied practice, which is more metacognitive and provides less holding for teachers. So I'm a fan of both, right? You need the metacognitive and you need the more embodied. You need both. In short, don't perpetuate the myth that mindfulness is a unique trigger of trauma. It might be, but it's not a special one. There's lots of trauma triggers that are going on in the classroom already, right? Mindfulness is probably not going to make that worse, especially if you follow these rules for what children's mindfulness looks like. Most importantly, be careful with children's teachers and hearts, no matter which SEL approach you choose. So that's my little soapbox about mindfulness and trauma and whether, thank you. You know, I've heard people say things like, it might be dangerous to do mindfulness with kids. And again, I don't necessarily disagree, but if it's dangerous in the classroom, it's dangerous right now already, right? Okay, it's 11:22. Any questions? Questions for me? Come on. What? Okay. Okay, well, let's start here and then here. Yes.
The answer in maybe 3 or 4 sentences. How would you describe SEL and mindfulness? The difference. I mean, can you do that? Can you?
What's the difference between SEL and mindfulness? Different people will give you different answers to that. I see SEL as the overarching approach to culture and climate, to establishing nurturance for children and for teachers. I see it as the overarching construct. And I see mindfulness as a tool. I'm a believer that mindfulness is a very, very handy tool in this sense, because it's pretty impossible to be leading a mindfulness exercise and yelling at a child at the same time, right? So might they yell 5 minutes later? Maybe. But I think it's a really nice, smooth pathway into that, into the adult SEL. So that's how I see it. Other people want to say what they think about that? Barnaby. And then we have to go into the back.
I just want to say that, first of all, Amanda's one of my critical thought partners for anything that I do in New York City. I will call her up sometimes and practice what I'm going to say with Amanda. We did that a couple times. But I'm beginning to realize that mindfulness is a holistic approach to living in a increasingly complex and ever-changing world. And that social emotional learning is certainly a piece of that pie. But mindfulness is something that isn't just for social emotional learning. It's for many other aspects of coming to terms with the world that we're living in. It's still not a panacea, but I see it as a primer, the white primer that you put on the wall before you put whatever colors you're going to put on the wall. So I would flip it, but not without also understanding where Amanda's coming
And
from.
I feel the same way. I don't disagree with what you just said, but putting it in the context of schools in particularly, that's my frame. But I hear what you're saying. Yes, you in the back, you had a question. And Castle is here too. They're great partners for that. Yeah.
And I used to work in a therapeutic day school, and I think that mindfulness is great. I'm wondering though, like if some of these comments are directed at kids who are so deeply troubled that need so much deep therapy that
Yeah.
the process for them, the process for them is so mind-blowing and time-consuming that a school can't handle it.
Yes. So they need more than just the tier 1. You know this language of tier 1, tier 2. So yeah, it's not enough. What the teacher can do with them in the classroom is definitely not enough. My concern would be whether doing mindfulness practices, developmentally appropriate mindfulness practices, would make the situation for a child like that worse. And I just have trouble believing that. Yeah. Okay. There are limits to what a teacher can do, absolutely, and should be. There should be limits. Yeah. Yes.
I just have to say, I love what you said about that it's not awful, it's bad.
It doesn't have to be awful to be bad, yeah.
Because I think so many of our frustrations as teachers, social workers, whoever in the schools, are with those kids who maybe don't have traumatic backgrounds. They have nice families, but they're really struggling, and that cognitive load and the stressors that they present, whether it's within themselves, their ability to self-regulate and manage their own stuff versus how much trauma they've been involved with is interesting, and I like that because I think we deal a lot more with that than trauma. Not to say there's not trauma, because there is.
No, absolutely. I think it's a way, there's a few reasons why we might do that, right? We might try to other people, be like us versus them. They're the traumatized ones, or I don't deal with those kind of kids, right? It might make us feel a little bit better. So that's why I, try to scare you a little bit with like that, that interparental conflict study and all of that to say that, you can't be too tender with a child, with a student of any age. Yes?
I'd just like to thank you. In one of these tweets, you mentioned teachers being professionals, and I think what angers me about articles like this is not that we don't deserve criticism like every other field,
Right.
but it's the assumption that we don't self-criticize and that we don't think about what
Right.
we're doing, and that we
Right.
need other people to do that for us.
Right.
So thank you.
Right, sure. And that, again, teaching is that profession where you have to change what you do every year, right? The curriculum might change every year. The laws might change. So teachers are very adept at doing that. And so I think they're very adept at knowing what mindfulness can be, as they are with anything else. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
I just wanted to say that something is better than nothing, right? Like, Rick Hansen, one of my mentors, he says, "Mo better, more is better." Like, more is better, but something is also effective and important for us.
Yes.
And I think it's also the difference between SEL and mindfulness is literally lots of practices, hands-on tools.
Right.
That I think makes SEL a complete package.
Yep. Yeah, I've said something very similar to that, which is there's some things where a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, but mindfulness is not one of those, right? Research is one of those. Policymakers have a little bit of knowledge about research, and that is very inconvenient for me a lot of the time. But mindfulness is not one of those, right? A little bit of knowledge is good enough to get started. Yeah. Yes.
One thing I see it as too is when you're doing mindfulness, it's helping that nervous system calm so kids can make room for other things. And that there's a lot of times where they're not able to do that. So building that, helping them with the skills to breathe or to be in the moment prepares for higher cognitive functioning. I think that nervous system.
Thank you. Any final questions or comments? Well, thank you very much.